My name is Darius Nassiry. I'm a sustainable finance and climate change expert. I've worked with a number of think tanks in Washington and abroad.
So, where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in California and moved out to the East Coast later in my life.
Okay. And did you have like formative things as a kid that really shaped the direction that you went? Because obviously your work really does a lot with conservation and does a lot to protect the environment. Did you spend a lot of time in nature as a kid, or?
Well, I grew up in California, Northern California, Berkeley to be precise, and I was surrounded by people who care about the environment. I remember seeing the hippies down the street putting solar panels on the house, but at that time it was sort of an exception. People were trying out new things and it hadn't really become mainstream yet.
Okay. So then you chose to study biology for your undergraduate degree, is that correct?
That's true.
And what led you to that?
I was interested in how systems worked, and biology seemed like a really tangible, concrete way to both educate myself on a practical skill and also learn more about the world in a way that I couldn't train myself.
Okay, so that was interesting. You said systems there, and obviously the biological system is one thing. You then kind of shifted towards studying systems on a broader spectrum. You did public policy for your graduate work, is that correct?
That's true. When I was in college, I started becoming interested in the world outside of the lab. I went overseas twice, which was unusual for my undergraduate college, and became interested in foreign policy. And I realized that in order to help society and the world, you really had to go upstream. Upstream in the sense of going as far into the policy-making space as you can. Because if you're dealing with problems as they emerge downstream, it's almost too late in the game to do much about it. So I was interested in foreign policy and then economic policy. My graduate degree was in public policy and economics.
Okay, so we'll dig more into that in a sec, but where did you go when you were an undergrad?
Undergraduate, I went to school in Minnesota,
Okay.
which at the time was as far away from home as I could get. And it was an interesting difference from California because I was in a much colder environment. Part of the reason I went overseas was to see the world outside of the US. I went to Denmark for the first trip and the second trip to Australia to study marine biology and English literature. Both of those experiences really opened my eyes to the world outside the US. And I became interested in how can one engage in a life that's global. So my first major professional opportunity was to join the Foreign Service, US State Department. I went to Mexico and Kenya, and those experiences gave me a grounding in dealing with foreign government officials, seeing the world from a point of view outside the United States, and getting a feeling for what both I knew and needed to know in terms of policy experience.
Perfect. You got ahead of me even with the foreign policy stuff. That's awesome. So you were a diplomat for a little bit doing that, and then what led you to leave the Foreign Service and start pursuing a career elsewhere?
I knew that I needed to know more about economics if I wanted to make an impact in the world. I felt like there was a deficit in my education, having studied mainly sciences. And I had an opportunity to go to graduate school in public policy, and it was a 2-year commitment that took me away from the State Department, and I thought this is a risk worth taking. So I left the State Department for that opportunity and spent 2 years in Princeton.
So one of the things that your bio mentioned is your work with green investment banking. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is and how you got involved in it?
Sure. Well, over the last 10 years or so, there's been a growing interest in sustainable finance. And in that context, people are increasingly interested in how to mobilize capital for low-carbon, climate-resilient investments. One of the mechanisms to do that is through an institutional response, such as a green investment bank. These are specialist institutions that are usually quite location-specific. The UK has had a green investment bank, Australia, a number of other jurisdictions have taken the step to form an institution that mobilizes private capital and directs that capital to sustainable investments. These could be offshore wind, they could be solar farms, they could even be residential energy efficiency investments. And these institutions are really geared to identify bankable investments, mobilize private capital, and then direct that capital to these kinds of investment opportunities.
So I'm interested in that term sustainable investments, because obviously that's talking about investing in things that are sustainable and in sustainable energy and sustainable marketplaces and those sorts of things, but it's also about the returns too, right?
Mm.
Because, you know, if you're investing in something that's sustainable, you're talking about long-term steady returns. You're not talking about necessarily a short-term windfall or short-term bankruptcy. Could you speak a little bit more to why I, as an investor, might, or why I should be investing in sustainable markets?
Well, the first reason is that these are long-term investments, as you noticed, and the physics of climate change means that sustainable investment will be the direction of the future. It's unlikely that we can see long-term growth from a fossil fuel and extraction economy because the physics of climate change are going to catch up to the real economy and lower the value of those investments over time. One of the big worries in this space is, in fact, that those investments will lose value quickly. And if that happens, you could see dislocation of financial markets. That's why the Bank of England, that's why the Federal Reserve and other serious financial analysts are looking at climate change as a long-term risk to the financial sector and the real economy. That plays in favor of longer-term views on sustainable investment. So that's not just renewable energy. It could also be energy efficiency, green buildings, and other forms of investment that take a longer view in terms of how energy is used and resources are optimized.
And so your work, it seems like it focuses more on the developed world, or do you also play into the developing world? How do you, what do you, this might be a retake for me, but, so yeah, I guess speak a bit more to where it is that you work and where it is that these green investment banks are doing their work.
I mean, the dichotomy between developed and developing is something that was invented, a term that was invented 50 years ago. And I think that term is blurring in the real world because emerging markets and even developing countries are growing fast enough that they have bigger middle classes. And even developed economies like the US have pockets of their economy, our economy, that are more like developing countries in many ways. So I think that differentiation is blurring in the real world. In countries like Australia, UK, Japan, we've seen the emergence of financial institutions that focus on green and sustainable investment, but we're also seeing developing countries and emerging markets copying those models and learning from those experiences. So I think over the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see an emergence of new institutions that are focused on sustainable finance. We already see that in existing institutions that are trying to green their own balance sheets and portfolios. Institutional investors have increasingly focused on sustainable and green investments, and we're seeing a massive flow of capital into this space, partly for generational reasons, partly because people recognize the risks associated with the extraction and fossil fuel economy, and also because the millennials and the generation that comes after millennials are looking at the long-term future and want to invest their capital in directions that are sustainable and are going to preserve their own futures. In terms of developing countries, I think developing countries are looking at developed economies as role models to, and opportunities to leapfrog those experiences, build their own institutions on the back of those lessons.
So are there any particular aspects of your work or any individual projects you've been involved with that you would say, like, this is it, this is what I'm the most proud of, if I had to point to one or a couple of things?
Well, I'm always looking at the horizon and trying to detect where the direction of travel is likely to be. And right now, one of the most exciting projects I'm working on is to invent an institution that will address one of the biggest challenges we face, which is how to mobilize sustainable capital into cities. Today, we have a major problem. Cities are the fastest growing form of human organization. More people are living in cities, more economic growth is coming from cities, and more emissions can be attributed to economic activity in cities. But the institutions we've built after World War II were really geared toward countries. Development was a priority for the World Bank and other regional development banks. But we don't have a development bank that's focused on cities. So for the last year or so, I've been working with the Overseas Development Institute, a think tank in the UK, and C40, a cities network that's focused on climate change, to see if we can identify a way to develop a multilateral institution that's focused on cities as the primary clients. So that's a project for the future, but one that, if it comes to fruition, will be a major accomplishment and hopefully an institution that can respond to the real needs in the world.
That's quite interesting. It kind of calls to mind, you know, the U.S. obviously is withdrawn from Paris Climate Accords, but individual cities have voluntarily stepped up and said, we're going to be a part of this, even though they can't sign it in the same way that a nation state can. And that's really quite quite interesting. Do you have any other thoughts on that and on like the direction of environmental consciousness in the U.S. and in the world more broadly, what some of the shifts have been maybe?
Well, I think what we're seeing is sort of a two-tier process. On the top level, we have policy direction set by agreements like the Paris Accord. And on the bottom level, we have initiatives like America's Pledge and We Are Still In, where cities, counties, corporates are demonstrating their commitment to longer-term sustainability. I think ultimately you see a merging of those two, and they're mutually supportive. But we've always seen climate action at the subnational level, even before the current administration signaled their intent to withdraw from the international treaty. And that's because, like I saw when I was growing up in California, there are pockets of the world that are long-term committed to climate action sustainability, and that's not going to change depending on the international scene. On the other hand, having the international policy layer supporting subnational action is critical to the long-term view that people take in terms of where their investments are going to find returns. So they're mutually complementary. But I think the decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord demonstrates that political will is anchored in the subnational level. And if we can develop institutions that can respond to that will and support that energy and momentum at the subnational level, then we will be reinforcing the longer-term direction of travel. And that's going to be very important because we don't have that much time to act. We've got about 10 or 20-year window to bend the emissions trajectory in the direction we need to see for a sustainable future, and that's an existential issue. We need to do that now.
So that so that takes me to kind of my favorite question here, and it's been said that the greatest opportunities come from the greatest challenges. Rising to meet those is where where we're able to do the most impressive things as a species, as a society. Obviously climate change is quite possibly and quite probably the most pressing issue that humans as a species have ever faced and had the ability to deal with. Could you speak a little bit more to the opportunities that this really momentous thing does present? Because there are, like you said, opportunities both to change it and to reshape how we live and how we are in response to it.
Well, I think it is a major challenge. It may be the major challenge for our generation and to a large extent for our species. We have shown tremendous resilience over the time we've been alive as a civilization to respond to threats and challenges. The iPhone is less than 10 years old, and yet it's already reshaped our society. I think we're at a historical inflection point in terms of demographics, technology, economics, including economic inequality, and a recognition that we face this existential threat as a species. I think this is probably the first generation in human history that can recognize a threat to the entire species and have the capability to respond to it. The reason why technology changes are relevant to this question is because we have seen rapid drops in the cost of renewable technologies that will play an important role on the energy side. Solar prices have plummeted over the last 20 years. Since I saw them being installed, solar panels installed on the roofs down the street from my house. Wind prices have similarly fallen as the economies of scale have increased. And battery storage is the next major technology to fall. Those three will create a massive disruption in the energy sector, the sector I was trained in as a banker. And we're already seeing the effects on the coal sector in the US. The next big question is, how will that trajectory of cost declines affect the fossil fuel economy? We're seeing big changes in electric vehicles, mobility. I believe that the low carbon economy of the future is not today's economy with less carbon, but a fundamentally different economy. And that's why the way we interact as humans, the way we recognize ourselves as either a nation state or as a global community, and the way we respond as a whole will determine the future of our civilization. And there's no bigger problem and bigger opportunity to work on than that. That's why it's exciting.
So I'd like to talk a little bit then about fossil fuels. You mentioned those, and one of the things that your website, I don't remember if it was your bio or somewhere else, talked about was the orderly withdrawal of capital from fossil fuels and from other extractive, unsustainable industries. What does that look like? How do you convince like ExxonMobil that they're going to have to withdraw their capital from that? How do you convince institutional investors and pension funds and things like that? And how also does that play into the societal element of, there are a lot of people without degrees or anything like that making a lot of money in the back end right now, for example, and how do you convince them, and how do you, the orderly withdrawal of capital is not just the top guys, but it's also those guys who now have to find other jobs. How does that all look? How does that all play?
Well, I mean, we've built our society over the last 100 years on the back of fossil fuel extraction and use. That's a reality. We are surrounded by fossil fuel products, including plastic. We drive cars that still depend to a very large extent on gasoline and diesel. And we live in a world that's constructed on the assumption that we can drive to the places we need to go. That's a physical reality. And we have many people in our society that are either directly or indirectly employed by an economy that's dependent on fossil fuel extraction. That's a challenge because we know that we have more fuel in the ground than we can safely burn and stay within the Paris limits. That's also a reality of the physics. Organizations like Carbon Tracker have identified the carbon bubble and have noted that there are many assets in our current economy that will be stranded if we try to comply with our Paris targets. So we have to reconcile those two realities. There have been serious analysis undertaken that look at how much time we have to bend the curve. And it depends on how efficient our economy becomes. It also depends on how sensitive the climate is to CO2 and other kinds of greenhouse gas emissions. So there are some uncertainties associated with that. But the long-term reality is that we have to wean ourselves from the fossil economy and make a transition that is both efficient from a technology standpoint as well as just from a human being standpoint. We need to make sure that we create jobs that are sustainable for people who need to work and help people who are dependent on the fossil economy directly to transition to roles that are more sustainable. Those solutions have not yet been fully invented. Some of them exist, but we need to create new kinds of jobs that will allow people in your generation, people in my generation to participate in an economy that's much lower carbon in the future if we want to live in a planet that's lower than 2 degrees higher than industrial temperatures.
But you're hopeful for the future? You think we can invent those solutions and that we can get the market to do those things?
I think there's no other option than to be hopeful. As Lord Stern, who wrote the Stern Review and got much of this movement started, said there's no long-term growth plan that's a high carbon growth plan. We have to think in terms of low carbon options. And I like to say, don't bet against the humans. We're an incredibly inventive and creative species. We're the only species that's aware at a species level of the risks that face us, that we face. And I think we can invent our way out of this, but we're going to have to think differently. We're going to have to think differently about how fast we can adopt new technologies. We're going to have to think differently about how we interact, work, and live. And we're going to have to think differently about how we care for each other as members of a common shared humanity on this planet.